Well, hello and welcome to the session of ExecuNet Master Class. I'm your host, as always, Tony Vlahos, and my guest today is the CEO and Chief Board Consultant of M.A. Pfister Strategy Group, Mr. Mark A. Pfister. Whether you're an aspiring or experienced board director, you've got to understand the steps to successfully plan and implement your modern board director candidate strategy. In this session, you will learn the key areas to focus on to help you convey the experience and confidence needed for serious board director consideration. Really important stuff, and a part of our daily commitment here at ExecuNet to connect you with people like Mark, who understand executives and executive life and really know what it takes to get to your next great next, whatever that might be for you. Well, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. Mark A. Pfister is, as I said, the CEO and Chief Board Consultant of M.A. Pfister Strategy Group. That's an executive management and board consulting firm that serves as a strategic advisory council for executives and boards in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Mark founded the International Board Director Competency Designation, Education and Certification Program, which is a board director certification course recognized globally. He is a board director and board consultant. He's worked with hundreds of public, private, and nonprofit organizations and their directors with focus in strategy, governance, technology, and cybersecurity. He speaks at over 60 events yearly on these topics. Mark is also publishes a monthly board director, advisor, and C-level newsletter that reaches well over 27,000 business leaders in over 70 countries. And his book, Across the Board, The Modern Architecture Behind an Effective Board of Directors, reached Amazon's #1 new release in corporate governance and is in circulation in over 70 countries. My goodness, with that introduction, welcome, Mark, to the ExecuNet stage. They are all yours.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And a special thank you to you and to Kimberly for making this happen today. It's absolutely a pleasure to be with the whole, with the ExecuNet audience today. So let's jump into this. We have a lot of content areas to cover, but I also want to make sure that we do this in a way that allows for the deep understanding of these areas. And I want you to think about everybody to think about the terminology of discipline behind board directorship, even as it relates to your candidacy. As we talk about, as we go through today's topic. So let me first start out with some of the goals or how we're going to go about talking about our topics today, just so you understand the path and the roadmap I'm going to take you down. So number one, go into a little bit of detail on your particular board director viability. And I want you to think about this from both sides of the table, meaning that from one aspect of being an aspiring director, but also understanding that in today's realm, even if you consider yourself an experienced director, there are things you want to be aware of as it relates to being the chosen one for board opportunities. I want to shed some light also on proper board candidate packaging. There's a lot of misinformation in this area as it relates to global candidates and what they're submitting for these opportunities and what those documents should look like. So we'll go into some detail on that. I want you to also understand what is some of the pre-work you can do in preparing yourself as a candidate, understanding the organization that you may be thinking of joining or a seat that will be offered to you. And correlating that also into number 4, your board interview readiness. What are you doing for this? What are you thinking about? And how do you help in guiding this conversation so it's not just a monolithic or one-sided conversation where an evaluator is asking questions and you're giving answers? You really want to make this more of a conversation. And then hopefully you're at the point where you're offered the board seat. And from there, how are you making your decisioning? Or what is your decisioning process on whether or not this is the right opportunity for you? There'll probably be a few surprising things you'll hear me say at that point based on the number of opportunities that you should actually say no to. And after that flattery in the first few hours of being offered the board seats, why most of those scenarios you likely should say no to based on risk in other areas. We'll talk a little bit about that. I know there'll be questions that come up from that area, but I want to be honest and open and truthful in how you should be thinking about these opportunities based on their risk levels. Okay, let's start out with your board director viability. And a few interesting things. There was a report that came out recently, and this is catered towards those folks that think, well, I haven't reached the proper level or title in my industry or in my career as of yet, so I shouldn't really be thinking about board directorship yet. I'm going to tell you that that's not a major concern anymore. It used to be even 10, 15 years ago. If you didn't have a C-level or especially a CEO level title next to your name, the chances of landing a public company board seat especially were quite low. That is absolutely not the case anymore. This report came out recently from Heidrick and Struggles. It proves exactly what I'm seeing globally right now as a global trend. And what this report stated is that a record share of seats were filled by first-time directors, and not only first-time directors, but first-time directors on public company boards, 43%. That is a massive number. It shows once again that the opportunity is there, regardless of whether or not you've served on a board or even a public company board previously. These numbers go on to say from this report that current or former CEO experience of that number, it's only 40%, and current or former CFO experience, 14%. These numbers, even 20 years ago, were unheard of. I mean, the majority of seated directors and board candidates that were in the pools would be thought of as either being previously CEO or previous CFO titled individuals. That is no longer the case. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is, why we're seeing this globally, and the true value that we're getting from this. So again, just dispelling the rumor that you have to have a previous C-level title or a very high-level senior level leadership title in order to get some of these coveted and compensated board seats. All right, so some of the background behind this is that modern boards are coming to the realization of many things. It's happening all at once. I like to think that this has to do with much of the transparency, not just through regulation and disclosure, but also through the public's pushback on understanding what's happening in these boardrooms. That could be through activist investors or those just simply wanting to know more information and making noise. The social media platforms have played very heavily into this as well. But regardless of how boards have realized it, many modern boards are now designing the board with a mixed industry makeup. We won't get into too much of the board architecture realm today. I will touch on it briefly, but best practice in today's board builds, or board architecture as I like to call it, should really have no more than 25% of the board members of that particular board from the industry that organization serves. So think about this from designing into your process of a board's layout or its structure or its architecture, that you're not just looking for people that come from that industry. It's one of the biggest mistakes that are made in boards even to this day, but we are seeing some change in this, albeit somewhat slowly. Number two, leadership plus deep operations experience. We used to think of operations as kind of piercing that noses in, fingers out mantra that's kind of the thing that we follow in the boardroom. But we're seeing that operations or deep operations experience is allowing for directors to right-size their strategies, to right-size their governance, all the pieces that really require some sort of deep experience in the operations space, not just leadership. Make no mistake, there's a big difference in those areas, and it really makes a very large difference in a boardroom when you see that linkage between leadership and the operations experience. So don't be scared in any way to show your operations experience as it relates to being a board candidate. Number three, historically underrepresented directors. This comes to our aspect of diversity and inclusion in the boardroom. Pretty self-explanatory there, but we think about the diversity of perspective, we think about that leading to diversity of thought, and we see the outcome of that leading to elevated outcomes and decisions. Now, deep strategy knowledge plus governance. In most cases, when we think about governance or board roles, we think about, or I should say, when we think about board roles, we think about governance first. I can tell you in my mind, when I hear board director or board opportunity, the word that first comes to my mind is strategy. For the sole reason that strategy is actually the input to proper governance. Hence, you cannot govern properly without an understanding of strategy on the whole, as well as the strategy of that organization. I always ask many boards, if they don't understand the strategy, what exactly are they doing in the boardroom? What are they monitoring? What are they governing? So modern boards are realizing now they need to look at a much larger level and a much deeper level, the strategy expertise that's coming in to their boardroom. Not just folks that have attended strategic planning committee or strategic planning meetings, but actually have deeper background in strategy, maybe even education and certifications. And lastly, we'll talk about some of these specialized vertical knowledge directors. And what I mean by this specifically, we typically classify education in the board realm as either being a horizontal certification or a vertical certification. Good examples of this, and it's not that one is better than the other, it's really about having a balance of these, but also focusing a pretty good amount of effort in the vertical areas. A horizontal education is more from the end-to-end viewpoints. Our certification, as an example that Tony mentioned earlier, the International Board Director Competency Designation, that is a horizontal certification. That goes from inception of packaging yourself properly to your interview, to performing on a modern day board, to even the outcome of decision-making and overlapping values-based decisioning in that process. That's end-to-end. That's a horizontal viewpoint. Vertical knowledge directors are ones that have actually specialized and in addition drilled down into expertise areas that commonly correlate to board committees, or what I like to say are the workforces of the board. So you're showing both the subject matter expert areas as they relate and your knowledge depth as it relates to common board committees, but you're also knowledgeable through your horizontal certifications and education for the end-to-end viewpoint on the boards. And I can tell you in much of the board interviewing that I do, and hosting of those interviews and guiding those interviews, I really try to dig down into this to understand that I'm not just getting directors, even so-called experienced directors, that only have horizontal knowledge space and not vertical as it relates directly back to areas of need in the boardroom, and more specifically as they relate to areas of need directly to board committees. Okay. And this is all coming back to your viability. We also want to know if you can dedicate the time. This is another area that is really a miscommunication and is misalignment. And what does it take to actually be a director? And for years now, of my time years and my firsthand experience in this space globally, I can tell you that very, very confidently, I have never seen a successful director put in less than 200 hours a year just for their base duties. Now, if you're also, as a director, serving on committees, or you're the board chairperson, or you're the committee chair, you're tacking on additional hours. The reason of importance to show this is that boards want to know that you have the time to dedicate. Most folks that are CEOs currently or have roles that require a lot of their time. This may be the showstopper right from the beginning. You may be going into this thinking you need 80 to 100 hours a year to be a great director. I can tell you whether you're thinking about public, private, or nonprofit boards, this is what it takes. And there may be some questions even when I mention nonprofit, but again, I have never seen somebody successfully serve on a board putting in less time in this. There's just too much going on. There's too much responsibility. Even the research that's required to be very good at your role and to stay current requires this type of time dedication. Now, on top of that, COVID-19 elevated these numbers even higher than the numbers I show here. In some cases, doubled or tripled. I won't get into too much detail on this, but it's just a point to show that you have to also be available and ready to dedicate time in addition to what these base numbers show here, if indeed there's some sort of crisis or something that forces more time for that board. The number of boards I've worked with throughout the COVID time where a good portion of their board was simply not available because they were so busy with all their other boards or their day-to-day jobs was unbelievable. The attendance of many of these board meetings went down drastically. That is not a board you either want to serve on, nor a board you want to be working with as part of doing your evaluation. Something to think about as part of your viability. All right, we obviously didn't touch on all the viability areas, but in our limited time today, I pointed out those three as areas I see very prevalent, that are very prevalent, I'll say, in much of the work that I do. Let's move into the board candidate packaging area. And this may be a surprise to some of those on today's call, even those that are experienced directors. So let me first say this. Technically, there really is no such thing as a board resume. I'm sorry, as a board resume or a board CV. There truly is no such thing. And you don't just create a bio or send a regular type of bio for a board opportunity. The proper classification and proper terminology of something that you would submit for a viable board role, they're called board documents. I'm going to break those down for you in one moment. Now, I don't want to say by any means that you should be correcting somebody if they ask you for your board resume or your board CV. My only point in bringing this up is to say that when you hear those words, you should be understanding that regardless of what somebody is calling these, you are sending a different document. You're not going to send, as an example, a resume, and I'll explain why in a moment. So first off, when we say board documents with an S, that includes 2 documents. For those of you that have been submitting only board bios for many years right now, I can tell you that that's not making the impact of the first impression you want to make. You want to send your both of your board documents. One of those is called your board bio. The other one is called your board document without an S. And the reason for both of these will be clear in just a moment, and I'll explain that. But I do want to say that there's a main reason for you thinking about this differently in what you submit for a board role. First off, resumes were originally designed for employee level positions. In this year, I worked here, I had this title. The following year, I moved here, I worked in this title, I had these responsibility areas. It's almost a chronology of your elevation of what you've done in your career. That does nothing for someone such as me who's evaluating you for a senior level position. I don't care about those things. I care about directly what is your correlation to the value you bring in the boardroom. And you do that by properly listing your experience, your expertise, and your core leadership traits, along with how you infuse values in your decision-making into your board bio and into your board documents. So remember, a normal job resume or CV, it guides you down the path of sounding more like management and less like leadership. And it shouldn't, again, be a surprise. That's what they were designed for. But they don't do you any favors in the board realm, especially as it relates to being a board candidate. And there is some effort you have to put into doing this. I'm going to lay out just the high-level areas of the differences of these documents in just a moment. But know also that as you get a copy after today's presentation, when you get a copy of this presentation, you'll see these links in many of the slide pages here. You'll be able to click on those once you receive this document. It'll give a little more color to what we're discussing at the moment. So let me specifically focus here on the board document area and why this is very different than a resume or a CV. First off, you want to be very much aware going into this that your board document is probably the epitome of the exercise of writing in being concise and being precise in your writing. It's a way of showing on paper exactly how you would operate in the boardroom, not going off on tangents on things that don't matter to someone at the board level or to that board specifically, but sticking to facts that directly support what makes you a great leader and what makes you a great board director. So start off with what's called your board profile summary in your board document. But notice what's next here. We're not going into a list of executive level titles. We're not going into the chronology of the years you've worked. We're not going into specific industries. We move next into what's important to a board. Tell me, if you have this, tell me what board and board committee experience you have. Don't give me long sentences. I served on this board from these dates. These were the committees that I attributed to or worked with or chaired while I was on those working in those organizations. We cut right to the chase in this. We don't beat around the bush. Then we move into what's called board level experience. Board level experience is saying that you weren't a seated voting fiduciary board member, but at certain roles throughout your career, you have actually presented or researched information or done something to help in a board's decision-making that you directly participated in. It's quite an interesting way to look at this. For those that have consulting backgrounds and have worked with senior level leadership, as well as boards, there's some great opportunity here to list the things that you've done to influence the decision-making for boards. Then we move into executive experience. We didn't start with this, we got to that now. We wanted to first understand your board level acumen. Now we're moving into your executive experience. Then we move into education, certifications, memberships, those types of things. And then one of the big differentiators that a resume and CV will never get across ever is, what are your core leadership traits? What is your leadership demeanor? What are the values that you place on the importance of how you come to decisions? And we do this through what we call your core leadership traits. Now, this can be done either by infusing these into certain examples in your board bio, Or even better, they can be done by allocating a column on your proper board documents, again, both your board bio and your board document, that repeats what your core leadership traits are as they relate to your governance style, your motivation style, those types of areas. Remember that a large component of evaluation in a board level interview is looking at how you interact, how you lead, and do you have high levels of emotional intelligence, EQ, and high levels of mindfulness intelligence, MQ. We'll talk a little bit more about those areas in a moment. So just a final thought on the board document area. And again, you'll get links to these articles that link out from this presentation shortly. Spend some time in this. Don't be the board candidate that simply believes that you're going to put a resume together and you're going to forward it out for the board seat. It's the easiest way for someone like me that's evaluating you to say, this person didn't even spend 10 minutes to even name their file correctly. Their file name says resume when it should say board documents, right? I already know that if you're not putting in the 10 minutes of research to submit properly, I also can kind of come to the conclusion that you may be of the type of person that's not going to do the research in the boardroom, which may relate back to the fact that you don't even put the time in that we talked about earlier, or allocate the proper amount of time in the boardroom. All right, so that's some of the packaging area. So let's say you've done everything we mentioned correctly so far. You've packaged yourself correctly. You've targeted the right types of companies that you're looking and that you're passionate about. What is some of the pre-work that you want to do as it relates to preparing yourself? And this is really the thing that separates those that are truly and deeply prepared in an interview versus those that are kind of showing up and it's very, very clear that they haven't spent their time on finding out more about the organization. There's nothing worse than for a public company board interview for you to ask a question that's very readily available through an annual report or even something recently as the filing of a Form 8K for any type of changes or material changes in the organization. So doing your research in this is extremely important. This is not, I believe it's not like going for a regular job interview. You really want to be focused on areas that are leadership related, that are governance related, strategy related, even looking at what this performance over a certain period of time is, changes to the board, changes to product and services. And you can do this again, public companies, very easy to do this. For many of the articles I write, I'm looking back 8-10 years in these organizations, looking at their annual reports, their forms such as the 10K and the 10Qs, obviously their proxy statements, looking at who's on the board, how their boards are structured, and getting even more relevant and more recent information on changes that could have materially affected the organization through their Form 8Ks, as I mentioned a moment ago. So there's really never an excuse for asking questions that are very basic and public knowledge for a public company. You really want to do your homework and your research on these. Private companies is somewhat of a different story. Very hard to get information on these other than what they've publicly released based on what they've wanted to release. There's no regulation or requirements for them to do it. You can't get copies, of course, of their tax filings, none of that. So a little more homework or detective work, I'll say, as it relates to private companies. Now, for those on today's call looking at nonprofit organizations, you again have a pretty deep window and a history through Form 990 filings, annual reports, and many nonprofits also will, on a yearly basis, announce their goals and their strategy and where they're spending their donations or whatever they're looking to accomplish in those time periods. So really, in this whole listing here, we're really saying that private companies are the toughest, and that's really going to put the onus on you to do your research. But be that prepared director candidate and know there's probably a few weeks worth of work here if you have that time before the interview to put into this, to make sure that you're going in there fully aware of where that company is at and almost acting as if you're already a board director, speaking and positioning questions and comments as if you've already been seated on that board is a great way to look at this. So you want to go in informed. Now, how do great boards actually make sure that their candidates are coming to the table prepared? And this is even more important for private companies, but can be equally as valuable in nonprofit and public companies. And it's what we call a board pitch book. That's the inward-facing name. The outward-facing name of this is called a board director invitation. And this is a great proactive exercise for a board to do in putting together their search criteria. I'm not talking about detailed listings. I'm talking more about a presentation type deck that lists some very important things that a director should be very, very focused on and caring about. Who we are and who we will become. That's both for the board as well as the organization. Should be no surprise for those that know me that values, vision, mission are very early on in this process. Most directors, or many directors I should say, are missing the fact that their correlation to their values is a big piece of this. And it's something I dig deeply into in interviews to make sure that the basic understanding of values equals culture equals the risk level of the board and the organization. It's that simple. And for someone that's not bringing those up early on, I'm really skeptical and worried about them actually serving on a board, especially if the candidate's not bringing those up. So some of the other areas here, again, a board pitch book is a great way for the board to define who they're looking for, where that person fits, the differentiators in the phase of growth of the organization to stop some sort of mismatch where you have a expertise in a director for a certain phase of growth, but that doesn't match to where you're at right now. Another pretty prevalent area of private company boards where they haven't matched back the phase of growth knowledge areas to those directors. Board structure is a big one. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So all of this is relating to your pre-work and making sure you're going into an interview and even preparing for any type of question or comments that you want to make or questions you want to ask are coming from detailed information as much as possible and showing that you've done your homework. All right, I mentioned a moment ago, I wanted to touch a little bit on this board architecture. This is an area I have been laser focused in for well over a decade now. The book you see behind me is on what I call board architecture as well. Just as a clarity point as we start, many people will say, well, why is board architecture different than board structure? And I say it in the following way, or I answer that in the following way. Board structure to me is more of a reactive type of comment. What is our structure? What is it today? How are we, what types of people do we have on this board? That's a reactive approach to this. However, when you use the word architecture, that to me assumes and implies there's planning, there's an approach, there's time being spent and looking more deeply at how the board is structured, again, through the proactive aspect of architecture. So you'll commonly, in most cases, hear me use the terminology of board architecture being the more proactive side. And as a high level dive into this, again, there's a lot to know in this. If you're interested, you can read more in the book. There's really three areas we look at for proper architected boards. This is either for boards starting from scratch in a newly formed private organization or a nonprofit, or directly associated also with public company boards that realize that they could be better. And as they roll people off the board, mandatory retirement ages, term limits, whatever it may be, resignations, they have a plan on the types of people they're going to bring in. So we look at this in three areas. Sphere of influence, number one, skill set, competencies, and experience is what's included there. That's the vertical considerations of a properly built board. Where most boards fail is they don't look at their horizontal or their depth considerations. So planes of congruence are considered horizontal areas that bring character to the board. This is evaluating EQ and MQ, as I mentioned a moment ago, making sure there's a balance of personality types. I always look for a balance of analysts, diplomats, sentinels, and explorers, as an example, sitting on a board. You can likely think of, if you only have explorers on your board or explorer personality type, you can likely think of a lot of the challenges that'll come up with that, of always looking forward and not focusing also on what's happening currently. And coverage and balance, this is the depth consideration. We'll touch on this one other point shortly when we talk about you making your decision of whether or not to accept an offered board seat. But the coverage and balance area, just know, is looking at, is there depth to this board? As an example, do we only have one person on this board that has technology and cybersecurity background? So whatever they say, it's open mouth by everybody else in the boardroom because they don't know how to vote. Yes, no, how do they weigh in on it? What we look for in a properly architected board is that there's coverage and balance. There is a way of somebody else, at least one other person on that board, that has overlapping experience to challenge, to elevate, to work through issues in those areas of expertise, so we don't get siloed knowledge areas. That's really a big challenge for boards today as we look across multiple areas, inclusive of technology, cybersecurity, Another big one is in human capital. We see this a lot on boards currently where there's one human capital expert, but no one else has anything else to add to what they say. They don't have the experience, nor the background, nor the expertise. So I'm not going to, you're not going to walk away right now with all the details of a properly architected board, but the biggest thing I want you to know is that you want to think about this and know that there is a more deeply implementable process and how to look at how proper boards are structured. And it's not just looking at someone's previous experience, their previous title, the expertise they have. That's one step. That's in your sphere of influence. That's vertical considerations. We need to go deeper. Much of the advisory and the consulting work that I do for boards that are experiencing issues that are simply not effective or efficient, they want to focus on the symptoms because they think that's how they're going to solution this. But typically 90% of board related challenges and failures directly relate back to that board not being architected properly. Keep that in mind. We're going to touch on this again when we talk about your evaluation of whether or not to join a board. All right, so let me do a quick time check. All right, so the board interview readiness, this is another big one. And I can tell you that there's a few things I look for in the interview readiness. And one is there a correlation between what this person has listed in their board documents, notice how I'm not saying resume or CV, their board documents, and do I feel it's consistent when I'm now interviewing this person? And I can tell you if there's an inconsistency between the documents that were submitted that I reviewed offline, and then when I meet you, I feel that I'm sitting in front of somebody totally different. That to me is a great indicator of something is off. Something's not correct. Are they positioning or elevating the things they've listed in their board documents versus how they present themselves in person? So how do we prevent some of what I just mentioned from happening, and how do we make sure we're driving the conversation down the right path? And there's 5 areas I typically look for in the interviews I do of directors. And again, I'll say it, no surprise to those for those that know me, that value sits at the top of this. A great board interviewer will start very early on in implanting the process and the understanding that values is very important for a director coming into their board, because they know that values equals culture equals risk level of the board and the organization. So 2 things to think about here. If you're in a board interview and the interviewer is not driving the conversation very early on into the topic of values as it relates to culture, as it relates to decision making, you should already start to be a little skeptical in how this board operates, how effective it is, and how efficient it is. That's number 1. Number 2 for values is to think about this as a great opportunity for you to bring up the topic of values, to show how important it is for you. Even give the example of the values of the organization that you're interviewing, your board interview is for, and show how you live those values and how you would apply them. It's a really great way to show senior level leadership knowledge and acumen by linking back to the values and the culture of the organization. Exactly where you fit, or knowing exactly where you fit. Now, hopefully through a board pitch book or the board director invitation, the board has already been very clear on who they're looking for, where you fit, what committees they would expect you to serve on, all the details you would possibly need going into an interview. So knowing exactly where you fit is important, but you also want to show that you're not the one-trick pony. And this comes back to how you package yourself. We typically call this your major and your 3 minors. All I'm getting at there, without going into too much detail, is showing that you're a subject matter expert in at least one area, but you also have the ability to serve on more than one committee area to show that you have the depth. That fits into the board architecture component, as we mentioned, the coverage and balance area. Strategy and governance. Started to touch on this a moment ago. At a high level, I'm even going to share with you today one of my most favorite questions I ask in a board interview, and it tells me so much about the level of leadership that this person has applied or had experience with. First off, should not be a surprise, I list strategy before governance. You cannot govern something if you don't understand the strategy, and you cannot understand a strategy if you don't understand the goals. The most basic principle of proper governance is that chain of events I just mentioned. The question that I'll share with you today, and I usually ask this question in the first 10 minutes of an interview. Tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. Again, tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. Now, sometimes I get answers back on that, well, they're two different things. One is governance, one is strategy, and they give me their definitions and their explanations. I can tell you those are the interviews that stop in 10 minutes and I move on to something else or go to another interview, because I totally understand everything I need to know at that point, that this person does not understand that the interrelationship of strategy and governance is one of the most important foundational principles of being a great board director. All right, so I shared with you that question. I'm going to show you a diagram in a moment as we dig a little further into this. All right, learning mentality should not be a surprise at all that you need to. We don't want people in the boardroom that have the ego that think they know everything. If anything, the need for exponential learning comes up, and you have to have directors that are truly looking to expand their knowledge and understand what's happening through trending and research. The other intelligences we'll touch on in a moment. I'm going to expand a little bit on the EQ and the MQ areas for you. All right. Quick expansion on what I just mentioned for values. This is the visual that shows that values sit at the top. They even sit above the vision and the mission of the organization. You're not going to reach the vision of the mission of your organization as a director without understanding what do we stand for, what are those ethics, principles, and beliefs, and how does that relate back directly to our decision making. We're not going to talk about it today, but I highly recommend if you're interested in this topic, you dig a little further into my writings. I talk directly about values-based decisioning. There's some great examples in this book, in my book especially, of how values-based decisioning can actually help greatly in your time management and not getting that overwhelming feeling that you're always having to make decisions, how to focus on ones that matter, how to jettison the ones that don't matter. Further expansion on this values and culture aspect that I mentioned a moment ago as part of your readiness is to really understand this diagram as well. Where does this sit? We all know that we're there to manage risk, both reactive risk and proactive risk as a director. But what many don't understand, again, is that values and culture actually is the first circle around that. You cannot govern, oversee, or guide the proper risk levels in an organization or understand what they are to mitigate them for the negative risk areas. Yes, there's positive risk and negative risk, by the way. That's why I say it in that way. Without understanding the values in the culture area and what you're driving towards. This is a great overlay of showing the board's governance areas or their purview areas as it relates to the overlap with corporate governance, values and culture, and how that all comes back to this central point of risk that sits in the center. All right. I mentioned I would talk a little more about strategy, and this is the visual I want you to implant in your mind as a great board candidate, whether you're an experienced or an aspiring director. This relates back to that question I shared with you from an interviewer's standpoint a moment ago. How does this actually look? When I ask that question of the interrelationship between strategy and governance, I'm looking for some sort of understanding, hopefully in depth, of what this diagram shows at the bottom half, right? So strategy is the how that sits between the goals and the tasks of the organization. And then if I overlay the governance lens of that, and I'm thinking about goals first and foremost, the board is truly responsible to set, or I like to say co-set with the CEO and ensure the relevance of those goals. That's not a one-time exercise, that it's consistently running in the background of a board director's mind in saying, are the goals still valid and relevant? And the strategy component of this is saying, is the strategy relevant? Have we validated this? Are these the best way based on budget, scope, and time to deliver the how in the support of our what and the why, to deliver the strategy in support of our goals? If there's one slide I recommend coming back to for those on this masterclass right now, it's this one. This is something you want to have embedded in your mind. It's an area that I try to dig very deeply in. If I don't get that sense from a director early on, or a director candidate, I need to make sure they understand this, or everything that they comment on, question, bring up in the boardroom is likely not going to be relevant. Spend some time with this. All right. Expanding also on what I mentioned with the other intelligences and where you should try to aim your discussion as part of an interview or being ready for an interview. Now, a good interviewer will try to ask questions. Some of them are very seeded questions or placed questions, as I like to call them, to try to see, how do you react if I challenge you? This is the EQ side. So if you make a statement, I challenge you, where does your mind go? How do you redirect your answer? Do you pause for a moment and then without a raised voice, do you answer that question back with more detail, maybe in more of a layman's terms type of response? Essentially, how are you focused in the right area of your emotional response as it relates to your emotional intelligence? I like to think of this as the reactive side to it. The proactive side to this is the mindfulness intelligence. And for today's time, available time, let us focus on EQ and MQ. Mindfulness intelligence to me is, even before you're confronted or asked a question and you're making the comment or initiating something, are you mindful of the audience around you? Is your board in the right mindset to be accepting of the information you're about to give? Or, rightfully so, if you know it's not going to be accepted the way that you would like it to be, do you still have a way to present it properly and make sure that it doesn't lead to a heated conversation, but it leads towards elevated outcomes? It opens up the door for proper communication. You're aware of your surroundings, basically, is what I'm saying with mindfulness intelligence. And the best directors I know, above and beyond their expertise and their experience, they have extremely honed EQ and MQ, period. This is the key to the proper communication. And I can tell you some of these I won't share with you, but some of the seeded questions or placed questions or comments that I make in the interviews for when I'm hosting interviews, I am truly trying to dig down into, how does this person communicate? Is it thoughtful? Is it mindful? And how do they react when they're challenged? That tells me an extremely large amount of information I want to know about their communication skills, how they're going to fit into the type of culture that I believe needs to be in the boardroom. Many evaluators are doing this, by the way. All right. Finally, a few things to mention before we go to Q&A. I'm watching my time, Tony. I'm about 2 minutes away. You need to be aware that there is flattery, quite frankly, with being offered a board seat. But I want to mention something maybe surprising and shocking here, in that at least 90% of the offered board seats that you will receive throughout your career, you should indeed say no to. And the reason for that I'm going to share with you now, but I can tell you the number of boards out there that are either too high of risk, are not structured properly, are not going to be fulfilling. And yes, I'm going to use the word fun, because board service should actually be fun and fulfilling. Remember that. So ask yourself these questions in your research you're doing through interviewing with these boards, through meeting individually with directors, hopefully even meeting one-on-one with the CEO. Ask yourself honestly, is this board truly successful? Is it a figurehead board? Is it only asking questions because it's filling the time? Is it making a positive impact? And also, is this board respected? Does the CEO respect this board? Do others in the organization respect this board? Does the board respect itself? Are people showing up to meetings, right? Are they involved? Are they focused in the right areas? Are they doing their offline work? Nothing irks me more than a director that comes to a board meeting and hasn't prepared with the materials that were sent out earlier. It's my biggest pet peeves. I just can't stand it. It shows total disrespect for the remainder of the board. And it, quite frankly, is a waste of everybody's time, including your own. Additionally, and I won't read through all of these, but ask yourself these other 5 areas of, is the board living up to its mission? Promoting meaningful action. Is it a trustworthy board? Is it considered trustworthy? Is it providing mediation and fostering accountability, not just for itself, but throughout the organization? These may seem like very simple questions, but if you truly take a step back and compare these and evaluate these in the organization that you could possibly be saying yes to joining as a board member, you find that these don't always come back as emphatic yeses or positive yeses. Many of them you'll start to question, and you should go with those gut feelings when you feel this with any boards that you're targeting. All right, is the board structured properly? We spoke a moment ago about this, just a little more detail on it. The vertical considerations, right? What is that board's expertise? We call this again the sphere of influence. The horizontal considerations, this is the planes of congruence. This is what brings character to the board. Is there a balance of personality types, honed EQ and MQ, diversity on this board, no more than 25% from the industry the company serves. These are all examples of this board's character that we would put into a designed process as it relates to planes of congruence or the horizontal consideration areas. And I mentioned depth a little bit in depth a moment ago, which has to do with, do we not just have siloed information or knowledge areas? Do we have some sort of overlap in this to allow for dissent, conversation, challenge, elevated outcomes in the boardroom? Use this architecture as one of your main evaluation points of whether or not a board is going to be successful. And if you are going to be successful on the board, I leverage this in my consulting and advisory realm deeply. I can tell you already that easily more than 90+% of boards, their issues stem from not being architected properly. They think it's other areas. They think they're missing knowledge or they're missing other pieces. But it's these three components that account for the majority of failed boards, failed outcomes, terrible decision-making, high risk. It all relates back to this architecture component I'm telling you about. So in looking at that architecture, it also can help ensure the adherence to the responsibilities simply based on the structure. I think I've gotten that point across as we go through this. All right. One last thing on the topic areas has to do with the D&O as part of your evaluation process. Are you protected? I'm going to quickly state in this, it's another highly misunderstood area for directors. Most people think that D&O insurance operates in parallel to your corporate indemnification. It does not. It operates in series. Corporate indemnification hits first, then D&O insurance, hopefully it's in place, and then you have the ability to get what's called IDL or independent liability, independent director liability insurance. You can purchase that yourself. Just know in all of this that the biggest risk area for most directors, they do not do a study of the potential gaps between corporate indemnification and their D&O insurance, and they take on extreme personal risk and monetary risk by not looking at these things. The corporate veil can be pierced very easily today in the boardroom for board directors. You need to make sure this is there. You need to make sure the coverage is there. By the way, this is also true for nonprofit organizations. The largest percentage of exposed directors personally and monetarily exist in the nonprofit world because they feel like because they're operating free of charge, they're donating their time, that they don't have any type of liability. And the number of cases is growing where nonprofit directors are being sued and are paying for their cases, their coverage, and their representation out of their own pockets. Don't make that mistake. Quickly in closing, before we go to Q&A, if you're interested in more of the board architecture, the in-depth aspects of proper board architecture, feel free to pick up a copy of my book. Many of the concepts as it relates to the proper packaging and modern day board directorship, the expectations, how to ace your interviews, how to package yourself, even the templates for your board documents. Those are all included in this Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate course. It's a globally recognized certification, your international board director competency that comes from this. But the key is that you're getting both modern day board operations as well as in parallel, the proper packaging. And that to me is the most important thing to be considering here is how they interact and getting both of those areas of expertise in one shot. All right, Tony, I go back to you. Let's go to the questions. I've been talking a lot.
All right, Mark, thank you. You've given us so much. And let's get to some questions. So what if I'm an aspiring board director, meaning I've got zero board experience? How do I construct board documents from point zero?
Sure. The structure of the board document stays the same, except for the fact that if you don't have previous board or board committee experience, which is perfectly fine, by the way, you saw the stats from one of my earlier slides, you simply remove that section of previous board and board committee experience, and you start off with potentially board level experience and then your executive experience. You have to start somewhere. Many boards will be looking for someone that comes with a fresh mindset, a fresh perspective. Don't think that you're out of the running only because of that. In many cases, your previous knowledge and your expertise area will go a long way in making that decision, as long as you are conveying your executive presence and your EQ and your MQ aspects we spoke about a moment ago. That will go a long way in making sure you're still a valid candidate for these opportunities.
So another question from an aspiring board director. We've heard that possibly the most effective way to get a board seat is through networking. Is there another way to learn about opportunities, or is that the main route that one should take?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to hopefully change the mind of many people on this master class right now. So number one, I am not a fan of networking, and it's not really how you land board seats, but I'm going to clarify that a little bit further. When we talk about, I'm going to correlate this even further. So in session 11 and session 12 of our course, we talk about two areas. One is establishing your authority, and session 11. Session 12 is successfully marketing yourself. We have to move away from the realm of thinking today that it's placement type organizations or search organizations that are getting or placing most of the open board seats out there today. It's simply not true. The key to all of this is for you to be establishing your authority, establishing yourself as the expert in a certain area as it relates to the boardroom or a topic that is needed in the boardroom, and drawing these opportunities to you. We call this inbound content marketing. And the way you do this is the following. You can do this through articles. You can do this through speaking engagements. You can do this through specific trade groups where you're joining and maybe contributing to something in some way for those groups. And I hope I'm staying on track here with the question, Tony, but the opportunities, you need to think about this differently. You want to draw the opportunities to you. That's the inbound content marketing. It's very targeted versus the shotgun approach, which is more of we call the old school marketing, the outbound marketing approach. It doesn't work. It's not how that works in the board space. A majority of the most coveted board seats today are not coming through placement organizations. It doesn't work that way. You need to be marketing and presenting yourself in a way that shows that you are a viable board candidate. And one other thing to add to this is and I'm going to bring this back to your packaging. Your packaging is so important in this. In the program, we talk about establishing what's called your major and your three minors. There's a lot to know there, but I'm going to give you the high level on this. Your major in how you represent yourself as a viable non-executive board director is something that correlates, or titles that correlate back to where your main expertise areas are as it relates to your industry area. Sometimes those can be titles, sometimes those can be expertise areas. Now, most people in their packaging stop there. What you need to do now is to show how does that correlate to common board committees. And this is what we call your three minors. Your three minors basically are saying, what are my three areas of expertise where if someone like Mark is reviewing my board documents, I see they list strategy, governance, and risk as their expertise areas or their three minors. I now know that that person could be a great candidate to fit in the coverage and balance area that I showed you as part of the board architecture. They're not a one-trick pony, but I could put them on a strategic planning committee. I could put them on the governance and potentially the nominating committee, and they're listing risks there. So if I have a risk committee, a true risk committee, I can either have them chair or be a member of the risk committee, or, which I'm not as big a fan of, they could be part of the audit committee because most boards are combining or integrating both financial audit with the risk of the organization. I don't believe in that. I think they should be separate committees, but you see where I'm going. It's a way to show more deeply in your packaging where you fit based on expertise that does not necessarily have to be boardroom expertise or previous boardroom expertise.
Got it. Gosh, there's so many intricacies and working parts. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
So real quick, is it critical to have P&L experience before you're considered for board directorship?
Yes and no, and I'm not a wishy-washy person, so let me explain what I mean by that. We would expect to have some sort of basic knowledge. So let me go back even earlier. It used to be, if you were not a CFO or a CEO or someone with financial background, this is 20 years ago, you weren't getting the board seat. And the main reason for that was that everything in the board, or a majority of it, was focused on finances because it was a solely shareholder driven board. Well, today we have shareholders and we have stakeholders. So it's not by surprise by any means that it's not that every director is being looked at for their financial background and their financial acumen. Let me first say that. So in the boards that I build, I like to have some sort of in-depth knowledge for a few of the directors, of course, especially those in a public company that are responsible for either sitting on or chairing the audit committee, right? Or some sort of finance committee on a private company board. But do I expect that of every director? Or do I want to even build a board that has all finance executives and finance experts on it? Absolutely not. That does not fit into any of the diversity of thought I'm looking for in architecting the proper board. I would say, and I have to remember a few of these points here, but in the course we talk about from a dashboarding viewpoint, especially as it relates to public companies, could be private as well, the areas that you want to look out for, things that you should be, even with little or no finance background, areas that you should be able to pull out from a P&L or a balance sheet to be a successful director. Anybody can do those areas. A prime example of this for a public company is looking at earnings per share, or areas that could actually indicate some sort of financial fraud. These are areas that you can be trained up on very quickly. We talk about these in the program. And even with no financial, I shouldn't say no, even with minimal financial background, you can become an extremely valuable member of the board by even asking the proper outsider viewpoint questions as it relates to finances.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned diversity in passing. Let me ask, have significant strides been made in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to board directors?
Yeah, and I'm going to specifically focus on diversity and inclusion because I think the equity component, this is not to be confrontational, the equity component in most boards has not been applied correctly to date. So I'm going to focus on diversity and inclusion. The answer is yes, I do believe there have been great strides made if we compare back certain regions to the percentages of populations in those regions. Meaning, as an example, if we look at a very good percentage now of boards that include what I like to call historically underrepresented populations in their boardroom, we've made a lot of progress in that in the last 5 years. That could be women, that could be certain backgrounds, certain cultures, those areas. I personally, having worked with hundreds and hundreds of boards, I see it, it's a topic of conversation. We just have to make very sure that we're focused mainly on the diversity and inclusion aspect. And again, without being confrontational, I'll tell you, there are a significant number of boards that have improperly applied the equity component, and they're having issues with the way their boards operate, both their efficiency and their effectiveness.
Okay, I want to take one more, Mark, and then we'll leave some time for some final thoughts from you. Earlier, you drew our attention to various types of intelligence, but you specifically drew our attention to EQ and mindful intelligence in the context of the interview. What about moral intelligence? I mean, you do cover value, and clearly that is a differentiator for you. Talk to us about how you can best convey your moral intelligence in an interview.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And by no means am I trying to say that EQ and MQ don't include moral aspects or ethics. And I like for this to be thought of as your communication style is a direct representation of your values and also the emphasis you put on the culture that you're trying or helping to create as it relates to how you communicate. So in applying the right EQ and MQ, emotional intelligence, mindfulness intelligence, the hope is that all of the underpinnings of how you apply those two areas and more areas, as you saw in those intelligence areas, what I call the Qs, they all have the underpinning of the values. What are you? What do we stand for? Is it all under this umbrella of saying these values directly align with the ethics, not just the principles and beliefs, but the ethics, the moral underpinnings of the organization? Do they relate back to the values? And am I outwardly and inwardly living those values through how I'm representing, communicating, interacting with fellow board members and the remainder of the organization? I love this question because it allows me to go through the interrelationship of why these concepts are not just siloed, standalone areas of importance. It is the interrelationship of everything we've discussed today and a ton more that make for the best leaders. They are thinking about all of these almost as second nature. It's in their DNA. We all know these great leaders that just inherently seem to do this without even thinking about it. That's what we're trying to get to here. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. We're going to have to start to wrap it up. You've covered so much territory. Thank you, Mark, for making time, for sharing your insight. Thank you to all who tuned in. I got to many of your questions, certainly not to all. I apologize for that, but that's what this link is for as well. If you want to connect with Mark on LinkedIn, by all means, but I encourage you, more importantly, to connect with him through that second link, Board Education Certification. You can take your individual questions with you and ask Mark. He will answer them fully, more than we could in the time that we had today. Mark, any final thoughts before we officially wrap up today's session?
Just one last quick thing. I know we're over in time, but I always think about this word of discipline as it relates to you as a board candidate. Remember, you're a board candidate, whether you're aspiring or experienced. There's a discipline behind doing this. It is changing. It is evolving right now, even as we speak. Don't waste your time in not preparing correctly with aspirations of board directorship without going about this correctly. There's a lot to know here. You can take all of your previous experience and wrap it into a disciplined approach. That to me is the biggest. I see too many people spend years in saying they're searching for board seats, but they're not even submitting properly, and that's only one of their many issues. Do it right, put the discipline behind it.
Really well said. Thank you again, Mark. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you at the next session of ExecuNet Masterclass. Bye for now.